The following presentation is brought to you by the Realm Network.
Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Hollywood historian Ken LaZebnik, author of Hollywood Digs, an Archaeology of Shadows. Stick around and take a good look at the next movie star glossy you see. There's no telling what stories lie behind it. So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview, brought to you by Amazon.com, Audible.com, and 1-800-DIAL-DJs. Please stop by the website, MrMedia.com, click on our advertisers, support the show. And remember, there's more than 1,000 interviews available at MrMedia.com. We've been doing this since February 2007. Hope you'll find something you like. And thanks for listening. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of glamour photographers who believe every picture of theirs is equal to 10,000, words. In the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. The only thing more compelling than a Hollywood mystery might be Hollywood history. I think my guest today, Ken LaZebnik, will agree. He's the author of a swell new book, Hollywood Digs, an Archaeology of Shadows, that tells the tales of people we think we know about in the glamour capital of the world, but LaZebnik has found new details and anecdotes that peel back the onion a little bit more than we could previously. Now, among my favorite stories in Hollywood Digs is that of stuntman, and two-time Tarzan actor Jock Mahoney, but not so much because of him as to learn something about his daughter, Princess. Now, as a fan of the Showtime dramedy Shameless, I was always intrigued by the end credit on the show. First assistant director, Princess O. Mahoney. What an interesting name. And now, thanks to LaZebnik, and he didn't know I was going to say this, I know the backstory, which somehow includes Academy Award-winning actress Sally Field. Go figure. Now, there's also a story connecting the Great Gatsby author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, with film butler Edward Everett Horton. And there's much more, of course, as well as more than 60 stunning duotone photographs capturing a number of bygone eras. And with that, Ken LaZebnik, welcome to Mr. Media.
Well, it's great to be here. And I'm thrilled that you're a fan of Princess O'Mahony. You're someone who watches credits very carefully.
Well, sometimes credits stand out at you. I mean, and sometimes, there'd be a name or an actual credit. This is the age of, kind of invented credits, both in print and in film and in TV. And people get to be all kinds of things that we would have never imagined years ago. So to see the name Princess O'Mahony, it's like, who the hell is that? who is, I mean, it's like, when you first started hearing Prince, the singer, it's like, Prince? What kind of name is that? Well, that was actually his name. And here, Princess O'Mahony. Holy cow.
Yes. Well, Princess is a friend of mine. And one of the reasons that Hollywood Digs sort of came to be, her father was famous stuntman and cowboy actor Jock Mahoney. And in Hollywood Digs, it's a very personal series of essays about Hollywood history. I try to find some little shard of evidence that leads me down a rabbit hole of history. And for years, my wife and I had gone to the Sportsman's Lodge, which is kind of an iconic old hotel here in Studio City, California, where we live. The Sportsman's Lodge was actually started by Wallace Beery, among other people, back in the 20s and 30s. And it was a place where, in Studio City, people could go. They could literally fish in a little creek, catch their dinner, and it would be cooked for them. Now, it's hard to imagine this today because it's in the middle of urban sprawl. But apparently Clark Gable taught his son how to fish at the Sportsman's Lodge. And they had a Cowboy Hall of Fame outside their patio cafe. And one of the framed, plaques was of Jock Mahoney. And our kids, Princess and my son, happened to go to school together. And so I got to know Princess, and I asked her about her father. And I should say, since you referenced her credit, Princess, a lot of people are not clear about what an assistant director does in AD. It's actually a incredibly important and vital, because you sort of see that title, assistant director. Oh, is that somebody who helps the director, gets coffee for the director or something? It's an incredibly significant, important role in filmmaking, which involves scheduling, making sure everything runs to the schedule. It's essentially the person who plans out each day of a film shoot, and it's and kind of make sure everything stays on track. It's being really at the hub of the entire production. So it's a very significant role. And Princess is great at it. Her father, Jock Mahoney, was this terrific athlete. And this is I discovered from talking to Princess and saying, can you tell me the story about your father? He was born in Iowa, served in World War II, came out after World War II, and started working as a stuntman. He had this tremendous athletic ability. Apparently he was one of the few people who could stand flat-footed behind a horse and without taking a running jump, leap onto the back of the horse. So he was this phenomenal athlete. He was a great swimmer. He started as a stuntman. Errol Flynn has a famous kind of fight sequence where he duels up a flight of stairs, and I think it's the Count of Monte Cristo. And that was actually Jock. Jock Mahoney did all of that work. And then he started acting. He started initially in, believe it or not, the Three Stooges did a series of short comedies set in the West. And Jock played a cowboy, kind of a goofy cowboy in these Three Stooges comedies. And from that, he was cast as the lead in Range Rider. Range Rider was a TV series of the 50s. He was the star. He was a cowboy. Perfect for him. His career took off. And Princess remembers, and he married Mrs. Field, whose daughter Sally went on to become a huge star. And then Mrs. Field gave birth to Princess. So Princess and Sally are half sisters. And Sally, Princess remembers at the time they lived in this expansive house in Encino. In the backyard, Jock, because he was riding high, he had rigged it all up with all of the things he needed to work out. He had a pool, he had a diving board off the pool, he had a barrel set up to practice his Cooper mounts, which are the kind of mounts you do to get onto a horse. He had a trapeze, he had everything. And he was always teaching her how to do these things. He was then cast as Tarzan. He was the 13th Tarzan. And it was significant because of two things. One, he was the oldest man ever to play Tarzan. Even at 42, he had this tremendous body. But as Princess noted, he was, truth be told, never much of an actor. He was incredibly handsome. He had this great physique. And that's really how he made his living. The second Tarzan movie that he did, they were shooting in Thailand. And he was asked to jump out of a low-flying transport plane into a reservoir.
Yeah, this was weird.
I don't know. I haven't actually seen the film, so I don't know what the backstory was. Why Tarzan had to do this, what he was doing in a cargo plane to begin with, but that was the story. And he did, being a stunt guy, he always did his own stunts. No one realized, or they failed to tell him, that this reservoir in Thailand was infected with human fecal matter. He caught dengue fever, lost 40 pounds during the shooting of this film, and it effectively kind of ruined his career because now he was no longer this great athletic person. He spiraled downward. They moved to a smaller house. His career spiraled downward. He within 5 years, he was playing one of Catwoman's henchmen on the Batman TV show.
Right.
Princess remembers. Then they moved to a smaller house, and one night she woke up. He is filming a biker movie, and he had ridden his Harley motorcycle into their living room. And shortly thereafter, he and his wife were divorced. And he always took credit, by the way. I said, well, so now Sally Field became this huge star. How did he feel about that? And Princess said, Oh, he always just took credit for it. He always felt like he took her to those acting classes, and so, you know, so and they had a very good relationship. He and Princess, obviously, as she said, he named me Princess. He adored me. This is why the name Princess. But he and Sally, actually, when she was had a relationship with Burt Reynolds, the movie Hooper was about a stuntman and was really inspired by Jock. So
Great
so
movie,
it was,
by the way. I just want to say this is a great movie.
it is a great movie, and he's such a compelling figure. And so my book tries to, before it's all washed away, because now that Cowboy Hall of Fame that initially started me on this whole search, they've renovated the Sportsman's Lodge. That's all gone. So it's a typical thing that happens in Hollywood, where Los Angeles has this knack for destroying its own history and just wiping out its own history. And I try to capture these little pieces of evidence before they get swept away by the sands of time.
Well, and it's really interesting how some of the dots connect in the book. You also have a chapter on the original Gidget, later played by Sally Field.
Yes. Yes.
And was it intentional to have those two things, or was it just coincidental?
No, it's often in Hollywood you feel like the world is as small as a freckle, and everybody intersects in some strange way. I had no plan to have any kind of crossover, and yet all these little crossovers occurred. As you say, I heard that information new to me, that Gidget, the novel, which then became the movies and TV series, was inspired by a real person, and that she was alive and well, and she's a wonderful, and Jewish, and she's a wonderful person, and she's become a friend. And her story was that, and what fascinated me as a writer was really in many ways her father's story. Frederick Kohner was an emigre from Eastern Europe, essentially fleeing the rise of Nazism. His brother, Paul Kohner, moved to Hollywood before he did and became a very powerful agent. But in the 30s, eventually, Fritz Kohner, forced to leave Eastern Europe, moved initially to London and then eventually to Hollywood. And he settled in Hollywood, as many emigres did during the period of World War II, fleeing from Nazi Germany. Settled here. He had a PhD in film history from the University of Vienna. So he's a scholarly man, a brilliant man, but he started writing screenplays. And meanwhile, his daughter, Kathy Kohner, loved the beach, and she loved going out to Malibu. And she was short, still is short. And the surfers there, she started hanging out with all these surfers, Moondoggie and the crew. And they called her Gidget, which was short for girl midget. And
I was stunned when you explained that. I always wondered where that came from. I was like, really? That's it? It's girl midget? Jeez.
It's girl midget. Makes perfect sense when you sort of think about it.
My God.
And she kept a diary, which she showed me. She has these diaries still that she kept from 56, 57, 58, which recorded her adventures surfing on the beach with these guys. And one day she said to her father, and she's in high school. She's like 15, 16 at the time. And she said to her father, I think I'd sort of like to write a story about my experiences. And he said, oh, well, I'll write it for you. And so she said, fine, he's a writer. And the amazing thing to me was, here is this Eastern European immigrant, this intellectual, who perfectly captured 1956 teenage California girl vocabulary, because it's all written in the first person of Gidget, and the lingo of surfing. It's like, to me, an amazing feat as a writer that he captured this so well. He wrote it in 3 weeks, and he got that phone call one night. He sent it off. Actually, his brother passed on it and suggested that another agent, William Morris, who then sent it out and got that phone call that every writer dreams of, which was the life-changing phone call one night where the agent said, you know what, it's been purchased as a book. It's going to become a movie. It's going to be a TV show. You're set. And Fritz Kohner never wrote another screenplay. He wrote many other Gidget books, but and then what sort of interested me was Kathy. Then, so here's the real person. There is a real Gidget, but nobody knew this, or very few people realized this. They assumed it was a fictional character, especially after the movie came out, Sandra Dee, and then the TV series Sally Field, all American. Certainly not Jewish, for what's that worth, and her life in a way became sort of consumed, but with this doppelganger. There was this icon of American young womanhood that was her, but it was not her. And I sort of became fascinated with that life that she's led, and she's kind of reclaimed Gidget in the last 10 years. She realized, this is me, and she got the book reissued, and so and now she is out at Duke's, which is a restaurant here out in Malibu, and is Gidget, for 2 days a week, and is incredibly charming and a wonderful person, and so that was another piece of Hollywood history that fascinated me.
Boy, if only you had some excitement for what you do, some enthusiasm for it.
Well, I do love it. I find it so fascinating. I grew up in the Midwest. I think maybe part of why I love it so much is because I grew up so far removed from it. I grew up in Columbia, Missouri. I would read about Hollywood, or I'd read about these stars, and it became sort of this fascinating world for me. And then I moved here eventually 22 years ago. And one of the things you discover when you live here and work in the industry as a TV writer, especially, most of my career has been writing for TV shows, is that it's a very blue-collar town. I always had this image of these crazy Hollywood parties and this wild life in Hollywood. And the truth of the matter is people have to get up at 5 o'clock to get to a set. And so it's really this very 9 to 5 kind of town for the most part. I've yet to go to a wild Hollywood party, put it that way.
I'll send you some information. I'll let you know.
Okay.
I'll let you know when we're planning the next one.
All right.
Okay.
Yes. Please,
Sure.
Please invite me.
Sure. So, how many stories or story ideas did you start with when you sat down to write the book, and how did you decide which made the cut and which either weren't going to work, or you maybe save them for another time?
Well, the beauty was the book started this way. About a dozen years ago, I had written one essay for my friend Bart Schneider, who was publishing a literary magazine in Minneapolis, where I had lived for several years. And this was an essay about F. Scott Fitzgerald. You mentioned F. Scott Fitzgerald. It was inspired because I'd gone on this big F. Scott Fitzgerald kick and had noticed in one of my books I read about his correspondence, this return address on Amestoy Avenue, which is in Encino. And I thought, I know Amestoy Avenue in Encino. I should go see where this was. So I went to where the address was and realized it had been kind of consumed by the 101 highway. But there on the corner was Edward Everett Horton Way. And digging further, the essay was about the fact that the penultimate residence of F. Scott Fitzgerald in Los Angeles, he actually died in Hollywood in an apartment, but his next to last house was a rented cottage on the estate of character actor Edward Everett Horton, who played butlers in those Astaire and Rogers movies. And I just thought it was so heartbreaking in a way that this great American novelist was reduced to renting a cottage on the estate of the butler, that I wrote it. Yeah, it's pretty appalling. So although Edward Everett Horton, to give him his due, was known as the mayor of Encino. He was kind of this big popular figure in Encino, a gay man who was closeted but lived with his mother, who lived to be 100 years old. And I have friends who actually remember, as children, going to that house in their grade school and singing for Edward Everett Horton's mother. At any rate, so that essay was published. And then Bart, a couple of years ago, had started a small press in Northern California, Kelly's Cove Press, terrific press that does books by California authors. And he said, if you just wrote like 10 more essays, you'd have a book. And so I said, oh, all right, that sounds good. And I had several ideas already. I think I'd already been fascinated with the story of Jock Mahoney from Talking to Princess. I quickly thought of a bunch of other topics that would interest me, and a kind of organizing motif, which was this notion that there would be some little shard of evidence that would lead me on this trail of investigation. And then, as is often the case, things kind of, once I opened my mind to that, things presented themselves to me. I went to a garage sale in my neighborhood and discovered it was the garage sale of actress. I went to two garage sales. One was the garage sale of actress Elizabeth Allen, who was an interesting figure to me because she both had a big career and is largely forgotten today. She played Paul Lynde's wife on the Paul Lynde Show back in the 70s, and she was in Broadway musicals with Sergio Franchi, and apparently had this torrid romance with him. And then here she is. I mean, she passed away, which is why there was this estate sale, essentially, of her possessions. And there were her headshots on sale, which I kicked myself for not purchasing one of them. And then I went to another garage sale, and then again, an estate sale, not realizing that I had walked into the home of one of the former Writer Guild's president, Mel Shavelson. And again, he was this huge figure for his time. Mel Shavelson was president of the Writers Guild of America. He wrote for Bob Hope. He wrote movies. But outside the industry, it's hard to find someone who would recognize that name today. And it sort of led me to ponder the fate of the writer in Hollywood. It's an interesting medium because, in a way, your work has a very good chance of living on well past you. Many movies and TV shows have this sort of infinite life being shown on the world, online, wherever, and yet you yourself are completely forgotten as the writer. The stars are known, but the writer almost often is not.
Ken, the Hollywood Babylon books are, I'm thinking, probably among the most famous and infamous Hollywood histories that there are. And I'm thinking that they focus entirely on sex and drugs and general sin. Your stories are fairly clean. I mean, there's references to Horton, being gay, but big deal. It's not like you're not giving us lurid stories. I wonder, did you deliberately take the high road in this book? Or was it not a question?
I think I was just I was attracted to stories about writers, and oftentimes writers lead less interesting sex lives than actors do. You beg to differ.
Well, I don't want to give away too much.
Yeah. No, honestly, I think I'll put it this way. I should say there was actually a moment where I was very conscious of not betraying the trust of the people I was interviewing. For instance, my friend Norman Powell, Dick Powell's son, told me this great story about the set of The Conqueror, which is this famous bomb his father directed in the late 1950s. And Norman, it was the life of Genghis Khan with John Wayne portraying Genghis Khan, if you can imagine that.
Right. And I know the movie, yeah.
Okay. Well, you probably don't remember seeing Norman in it along with Patrick Wayne. They played Mongol guards. And Norman had one line, which was something like, "Halt, who goes there?" But he said that the set was sort of this bacchanalia down in St. George, Utah. And an actress who, because we are in a public media, I will honor his request, shall remain nameless, literally dragged him into her dressing room. But he said, and he's right. Norman just said, well, she may have descendants. It's not really appropriate to name names. So I think, yes, you're right in the sense that I didn't whitewash anything, but it wasn't somehow the Hollywood Babylon side of things wasn't really my main interest in this.
Well, and the stories are quite interesting without getting into that. I mean, it's just fine. Now, the subtitle of the book is An Archaeology of Shadows. Explain that a little bit.
Well, I thought what I was trying to do was to do an archaeological dig, an historical dig of things that are literally, at this point, shadows. Either those shadows of film images, the typical sort of metaphor for film is that it's a shadow played up against a wall. Or in the case of so many of these pieces of history that have disappeared, all that remains is the kind of this little shadowy image. I cited earlier the Jock Mahoney, the Cowboy Hall of Fame that's gone from the Sportsman's Lodge. I guess in that case, there's not even really a shadow that remains, but these little shadows of history, that the Edward Everett Horton Lane, that sign that is there in Encino, to me is sort of like a shadow of Hollywood history. This little glimmer that if you had no idea who Edward Horton was or what this signified, it would be completely mysterious and lost on most people. So I was trying to recover these shadowy images of Hollywood history.
We were talking before, or you were talking before about Elizabeth Allen, and I remember I started reading that, and I was like, okay, Paul Lynde's wife. But then you gave the clue where I instantly knew who it was. Elizabeth Allen was played with Don Rickles on CPO Sharkey, right?
Yes.
And
Yes,
I knew instantly because we used to watch that all the time. I mean, I remember that's a mid-'70s show, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember watching it, and I instantly knew who she was. I mean, you got to be pretty good, either probably less so as an actress than just as a person, to be able to stand up acting against Don Rickles, because at any second he could go off script and destroy you, right?
Yes, and I think that's a great testimony to her work. It's funny the way TV works that way, that people can pop up in our subconscious, in our consciousness, from decades ago and be clear as a bell. It's one of those things that kind of fascinates me about what television has done to our culture, is that people tend to get frozen in time or frozen into a role. So that for the general public, to the world at large, Elizabeth Allen may be, that's who she was, CPO Sharkey. They have no idea she had a whole Broadway career, all the other things she did. Television has this way of stamping you indelibly. I've had friends who were on the Star Trek series, and it's Star Trek probably as much as anything. It's like you were on that Star Trek Next Generation show particularly, and to the general public, all of your theater work, all of your really fine work that you've done in other films or TV, that's how they know you. You are that character from Star Trek. And it's both a blessing and a curse. And I think oftentimes it's a bit of a curse.
Well, isn't it kind of like, when you fall in love and let's say you marry that person, you stay together 20, 30, 50, 100 years, God forbid. But you always look at that person the way they were when you first met them and fell in love. Yeah. I mean, that's always the way you see them. And I think I got a recent Hollywood example of this. On the Academy Awards, Kim Novak came out.
Oh.
And, I know I don't want to cast any aspersions, but I mean, she didn't look the way most people would remember her, and most people also thought, well, why couldn't someone with the production have helped her to look more like Kim Novak? And so TV does the same thing to you. I mean, we look at William Shatner. You mentioned Star Trek. We look at William Shatner. He's Captain Kirk. No matter what else he plays, he's still Captain Kirk. And that's kind of the beauty and the curse, right? Because you're beloved for that role that. I mean, Sally Field played Gidget, or she played the Flying Nun, or in the movie where she holds up the Union sign. Norma Ray. I mean, that's how we will always remember that person. But and that's
it takes a very rare actor who can transcend all of that,
right?
Or like, it's interesting, the Star Trek example. To me, William Shatner kind of embraces it and has fun with it. And Leonard Nimoy, who I think is more serious-minded in general, views it as this albatross a bit. Like the Spock part of his life. His book is entitled "I Am Not Spock," because he went to great lengths to make sure people understood this is not him.
Well, but even with Nimoy, I think at the time in the 70s, it was important to him to kind of reject it. But even he came to embrace it once they started doing the movies, and even the newer movies. I mean, he's done these commercials with the guy, I can't think of his name, the guy who was in Heroes, who plays the Spock in the new movies.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so, I mean, he's kind of, he puts the Vulcan whole...
right.
So anyway, so coming back here, were there stories that you heard, but you couldn't maybe confirm details enough to go with them in the book?
Well, a better historian might have gone that route. I'm not really an historian, so I sort of printed the rumor at times. I'm exaggerating a bit, but for instance, I cannot say with, I have eyewitness accounts that Marlon Brando drove down from Mulholland, stopped at our local Baskin Robbins, picked up this enormous gallon tub of ice cream in his limo, and then turned the corner and went to the house on Cantura Street where his makeup man came out, and they would sit in the limo eating ice cream.
It's a great story. Who cares if it's true?
I've had a couple of the neighbors tell me this is true, so I went with it. So, your question is certainly a valid one for more distinguished historians. I don't pretend to be an historian. I'm just a writer, but I do, at least I acknowledge this is how I heard the story. So it may or may not be true, but at least I confirm, well, this is the story on the street anyway.
Now, I want to say you're sitting. You've got the yellow wall and the white wall. It's a great set decoration, but it's not an accident that you're sitting with this painting over your left shoulder, and it fits into the book. Do you want to tell a little bit about that without giving too much away? Yes,
and I could even, well, I don't know if I'm this good of a cameraman, move the.
No, you're good. No, okay. You're good. Let's stick with where it is. I think we can see it pretty well.
The painting is Thomas Kincaid's Christmas Cottage, and I wrote the movie of that name. It was a movie about, and Tom Kincaid, God bless him, deceased now for a couple of years. He was very interested. Thomas Kincaid, for those who may not know, otherwise known as the painter of light. At the height of his fame, I think it was something like 20% of Americans somewhere in their home had a Thomas Kincaid, whether it was just a poster or a coffee cup or a greeting card, something with Thomas Kincaid on it. He was the painter of light. He specialized in these paintings, often of cottages, but that glowed with a sort of inner light. Sometimes they were lighthouses. He did hundreds of them. He was enormously, phenomenally successful and wealthy. And he also, I think, was affected financially, as we learned later, by technology. For years and years, he bought this enormously expensive lithograph printing press to make reproductions of his work, which were then individually touched up by himself and other artists and sold in his stores around America. Eventually, the color copier undercut the whole market for posters at enormously far less cost. And so we realized retrospectively he was looking for new markets and wanted to produce a series of movies. Well, he wanted to have a series of movies produced by somebody other than him about his life. And I happened to know the director, wonderful Michael Campus, a friend from Studio City. And we were walking our dogs one day, and I ran into him, and he said, do you have any Christmas stories? I've become friends with Tom Kincaid. He wants to do a movie about Christmas. And I said, well, actually, I do. I had written for years on a show called Touched by an Angel, and being one of a few Jewish writers on this show, I was the guy that did most of the Christmas episodes. So I was very in tune with its Christmas stories. And I pitched an idea which Michael Campus liked very much. Tom liked it. And in very short order, it developed into the script for The Christmas Cottage. And it featured a real incident from Tom's childhood. Growing up in this small Placerville, California, a retired artist and art professor moved next door and effectively became his mentor. In the movie, that role is played by Peter O'Toole. And it was one of the great experiences of my life. I mean, I have to say, I write about it in part because Tom, is gone now. He led a tragic end of his life where he slipped into addictions. But at the time, what was wonderful was we had to make the movie very quickly. And in a way, that was beautiful because there was not a lot of time for rewriting development, spinning through kind of development hell. Wrote his first draft, wrote several drafts, but it moved forward very quickly. Peter O'Toole signed on. Probably my most wonderful moment as a writer out here was we did production rewrites, which necessitated some rewriting of Peter's scenes. And we had not heard from Peter directly. And all of a sudden, Michael Campus, the director, got an email from Peter O'Toole saying, because we had sent him the revised script, and Peter said, I fell in love with the script you first sent me. It is a script I've committed to memory, and it is the script I want to do. So the director said, okay, fine. So and Peter was in about 5 or 6 scenes. So we went back through, and I kind of re-engineered the thing so that his scenes were intact as first delivered, and then I had to make adjustments to make the other rewrites fit. But at any rate, when the time for filming came, Peter showed up and was, I have to say, because people often say, well, was he, do you have any issues with drinking or anything? He was a consummate professional, and one of the great thrills of my life was the very first day he shot. He was asked to do this long set piece speech, and he said, well, let me just try it once. So Michael said, okay, fine. So it took place in this crummy little kitchen of the house that Kincaid was growing up in. And Peter just walked in the back door, planted himself, and delivered this speech full out with incredible intensity and passion, word for word, perfect. And, Michael said, all right, let's shoot. And it was just an astounding thing because Peter was like that. Every line, word for word, perfect. So the Christmas cottage at the end of the movie, this is a kind of coda to the movies. We see Tom painting this painting of the Christmas cottage, which was the house his family kind of grew up in. And he very graciously gave me a gift of, in the Kincaid fashion, both. It's an original of the Christmas cottage and not an original because there were several copies made. He personally hand-touched. So it hangs on my wall in the office now, a memento of my personal brush with.
Very nice.
Tom Kincaid, yeah.
Very nice. Now, I mentioned the Hollywood Babylon books. There were at least 2 of them, to my knowledge. So far, there's only one Hollywood Digs. Will there be more in the series? Will it be a series?
Yes, I would very much like, and Bart Schneider, the publisher, has said we should think about a second book. So a couple of ideas that have occurred to me are a book that would be about below-the-line people. This is probably not the sexiest of subjects, but it fascinates me. In Hollywood, there's an accounting term, above the line and below the line.
Right.
The line being this sort of mythical line that any of the creative team, which is to say director, writers, actors, are budgeted above the line. Below the line are the crew people, largely. It's the basic kind of way to look at it. To me, the crew people oftentimes have the most fascinating stories, and they're sort of the unsung heroes of every film shoot. So I think it'd be great to do a book about below the line. I know that from a marketing standpoint, people are more interested in stars than they are in grips, but it fascinates me. So anyway, so that's one possibility I've been toying with.
Well, I think the trick is that if you do the crew people, is to do shorter and more of them, because you're right. Yeah. I think people are more interested in the stars because they know the names. But if the below the line people, if you can keep their stories short and have a lot of them, I think that'll be compelling. But if you write the same amount about someone on the crew, a gaffer or something, whatever, the assistant director maybe, there's a limitation to how much people are going to want to read about an individual. So it's just
I could also see doing it as like above the line, below the line, interviewing the stars who worked on a movie, and then the below the line people who worked on the same movie, and getting sort of the Rashomon perspective, two perspectives.
I like that. Well, folks, listen. You can find Ken LaZebnik's book, Hollywood Digs, and Archaeology of Shadows, in great bookstores everywhere, I suspect. Or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. And basically, if you look below us, if you're watching this on MrMedia.com, below the video, you'll see the cover of the book. You can click on it right now. Ken, I'm guessing it's available as an ebook?
Actually, no. I'm very old school about this so far. The publisher, Kelly's Cove Press, thank you. I would love for people to buy it from you. It's also available through kellyscovepress.com. But MrMedia.com, obviously your first choice here.
That's right. Right here, right now. The cover is below us, and below the video. You can click on it and go right to it and get yourself a copy. I'm sure Amazon will send a drone to your house within 30 minutes. Or it might take a day or two. Ken, is there a website or Facebook, Twitter, any social media associated with the book?
Yes, I have been, as you may have gathered from my earlier comment on ebooks, I'm a bit of a Luddite, but I have launched my KenLaZebnik.com, which has information about events and book signings and links to the Kelly's Cove Press. So I think Ken LaZebnik, if you can spell LaZebnik.
I can. LAZEBNIK.
Very good.
That's
very rare. Yeah, that has all the information.
All right, great. Well, Ken, pleasure to read the book. Nice to meet you. And thank you very much for joining us in Mr. Media today.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The preceding presentation was brought to you by the Realm Network.